It's a pleasure to be here on short notice. The computer security field, as I'm sure you're aware, is funny, and there's some interesting forces at play in a very crazy and interesting and increasingly strange world that we live in. One of the things that I'm sure everybody here has looked at is the way companies and governments do security. Credit card companies and banks, and the way they do their security, and the lack of security that's sometimes prevalent with banks, with governments, all over the place. And every time the security community, we as a group, we tell them, well, what did you expect? It was broken by design. How could you ever expect this to be secure? Why didn't you invest in proper security to begin with? Whether it's chip cards for public transport, whether it's companies doing SSL certificates, whether it's disaster after disaster, we keep asking these people, well, how could you ever expect this to be secure? And as I've concluded at the GovCert Symposium as well, what these people expected is to gamble on security, and the gamble is cheap, because if they win, they get to keep the profit for the gamble. If they lose, we pick up the tab. In a world where corporations, banks, and even governments are allowed to play risky because the population picks up the tab, you get very risky gambling. They expect society to pay for the prosecution, for the arrest and the prosecution of Romanian skimming gangs, even though at Hack-Tic in '91 we published how easy it was to copy magnetic stripe with just off-the-shelf materials in literally more than 20 years ago. And the banks are still using mag stripes as their means of identifying that this is really a bank card. And it's still as easy to copy as it was back then. So they didn't expect this to go the way they want it to go all the time. They just know that there's no consequences for them because society picks up the tab. We get to deal with the increased crime. We get to deal with the increased call for more repression, more surveillance everywhere. You could wait for when the public transport chip cards weren't secure, and at the time there was no way to make them secure. And immediately, Translink Systems, the people that built this thing, said, well, that just means we have to have cameras everywhere so we can send the police after all the people that download this program from the internet and make these chip cards. So the call for repression is already built in. And there's this belief that cops and intelligence officials must be able to see everything. That if we can just simply press rewind, we can somehow address these issues, whether it's lack of security or any other problem that we perceive to have. As long as we have the rewind button, as long as we can look at what happened in the past, we can somehow fix it. And this is a perception that we need to fight at its deepest root. This is a perception that we need to fight, that you can somehow create the missing security that's missing from somewhere else by having this rewind button. And having the rewind button happens to now also be cheaper than it's ever been. Everybody has wanted this. Every government on earth has wanted this. Dictatorships have been more open about it and have gone further in wanting it, have spent more on getting it when the time wasn't ripe. The East Germans wanted a system where they could follow every typewriter, so they had Schreibproben, they had cards where every typewriter in the country had written all its letters, so they could figure out who had written any particular piece of text. Right now, that's built into every color printer that you can buy with the yellow dots. We're still alive, which is remarkable if you look at this discussion and if you look at this call for the panopticon, for total surveillance. We're still here after 200 years of industrial societies where we didn't know who was where. We didn't know who was talking to whom. We didn't know what they were saying. And yet we've survived all this. And now that we can finally afford total surveillance, exactly in the same decade that we can, There happens to be the eternal emergency that requires us to have it. So now that we can, all of a sudden it's required. And the funny thing is, this panopticon shit doesn't even help us. It doesn't get us anywhere. If cybercrime goes up by a factor of 10, what good does it do you that you can rewind? Can you arrest enough people? Can you prosecute enough people to make a dent in the profitability, or can you make a dent in the wave of new people that come online in new countries as they discover these vulnerabilities or as they roam the net? So it's all a distraction. We're going to, in the end, need the computer security that we're now skipping because we're calling for more security or more surveillance. We're going to need it in the end anyway. There's a lot of talk of national security. We need to be active in the cyber arena to fight for our national interests. But what are national interests these days? When I look at the international arena, I see multiple transnational groups stealing from a diminishing middle class. I couldn't even define what corporations are part of my national interests and what corporations are part of somebody else's. And intelligence, traditionally, is looking at a forest of corruption worldwide, at a forest of people lining their own pockets and trying to identify real threats within all this corruption. But we increasingly live in a world where the corruption is feeding on the population and is feeding on everything, and where the corruption is the problem, is the threat. And intelligence bureaucracies aren't set up to look at that threat because they are generally part of it. There's major elephants in the room. As we are all aware, nobody really knows what's in the Chinese networking gear, the Chinese base stations for cellular networks. Nobody really knows what's in the Israeli lawful intercept gear or in the Israeli billing systems. We're all uploading our data to the United States, be it on Facebook, be it on LinkedIn, be it on... We're all continuously updating a picture of our lives and our correspondence, personal or business. We live in a world where there's 3 major power blocks, and we're uploading our data to a power block that isn't ours, if you're in Europe, that is. We live in a world that's centralizing still, at least from an IT perspective. It's centralizing its systems. It's placing more and more data in the cloud, reducing local infrastructure more and more to just DSLAMs and routers to get online, and everything else is fixed somewhere else. Where in reality we're already past peak centralization. We're already past the peak of globalization. We're decentralizing. As the cost of oil is going to skyrocket over the next decade, as transport becomes a factor again, as power blocks fall apart, the world is increasingly becoming a mess. So we're going the wrong direction on that. And we see the same thing, this warfare also in the cyber environment. Many of you are aware of the economy of 0 days. 0 days can be sold, 0 days can be sold, can be published responsibly, irresponsibly, and increasingly the parties that you can sell 0 days to are no longer Romanian criminals and Russian criminals, but they are nation states and intelligence agencies. And if you look at the developments, if you look at Stuxnet and Duku, we are seeing the effects of warfare, true warfare, on civilian populations. The fact that there was all of a sudden 4 Windows bugs out there that were not responsibly disclosed and that were not fixed immediately is a direct result of warfare. And who gets hit by that warfare more than anybody is the people in industrialized and advanced societies. So we're looking at a population dramatically exposed to security leaks, and we're going to see an increase in that. We're going to see more and more and more security problems first coming to light as part of somebody's weapons payload that has somehow escaped whatever target they were trying to inflict. And we're going to see more and more of that happening without attribution. It's going to be completely unclear where something comes from. We're going to see false flag, we're going to see all sorts of non-attribution or false attribution in the weapons arena. So if you as a security specialist are generally worried about making the world a safer place, you need to fight this. You need to responsibly disclose. And I've heard people talk to me and tell me that, well, yeah, but they pay so well and it's safe. It's not like criminals, and it's for national security, or I'm doing something for my country. But you didn't work for some Russian or Romanian crime cartel for a reason. Was that only because it was more safe to disclose responsibly? Was it only, or is it really just about the money? And how are you so sure that working for an intelligence agency is more safe? I mean, I've spoken to people that in my mind really do scary things. Sell exploits, sometimes even tell me about it, and other people, I presume. These people that sell exploits to intelligence agencies or to military bureaucracies should really think 3 times. There's a remarkable amount of jargon in the intelligence world that deals with making people disappear and getting rid of the bodies and making it look like a suicide or an accident. The security researcher that discovers vulnerabilities and sells them to a nation state for surreptitious use is generally one of the few people that could point the finger in a world where lack of attribution is really a key factor, which I really want you to think about. But there's enough to be cynical about, and I don't want to be cynical, especially on a wonderful day such as this. It's great outside. I hope everybody has been outside. I want you to think about making the world a better place. And I want you to think about putting your knowledge to work to make this happen, making the world more secure, create a more secure and more livable online planet. And selling security problems to nation states or to intelligence bureaucracies is not some novel form of responsible disclosure. That's really it. Thank you very much. And I'd really like a discussion. I'd really like people to come up with, because I've just basically thrown in the room 5, 6, 7 different fields of thought, crazy things that I've been thinking about for the last year or 2 years. But if people have other interesting thoughts or expand on this, I'd love that. I'd hate it if I were the only one talking in the room. So please come to the microphones if there are any.
Yeah, we've got microphones here.
Microphones, great.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Bas here from Society. It's not that I hear what you're saying, I'm thinking FUD, but it sort of sounds like FUD. All these nations are doing bad things. How do you present this to somebody to make it sound more realistic and support it with statistics, etc., and get it out of sounding like FUD?
In a way, we are screwed. We live in a very precarious and interesting time in history. Much of our world is built on the availability of cheap oil. We live in a very precarious time. We've reached sort of what we can do in terms of growth. We cannot grow the human economic footprint another 4 times over, which is what we're used to doing. So you can't really, in my view, tell people about the world we live in without at least conveying that it's going to be difficult. So if that's what you mean, So you can't really paint a rosy picture without being dishonest. But you can, at least what I find is the future is also a very interesting place, and the present also has a lot of the problems that come with sort of the decadence right before the collapse. People are tremendously lonely, tremendously unhappy, medicated to make them happy, not in touch with each other, not in touch with where their food comes from, or so there's going to be interesting and sometimes positive changes in the future. And probably the 10 years that we get to terms with all of this are going to be very interesting times, not only in a negative sense. So there are positive lights in all these developments, if that makes sense.
It does.
Hello, and thanks for the topic. Nice conversation. I'm Adil from Iran, and I wanted to point to something that, it's not always about, for example, selling 0 days to agencies or whatever, and making own profit, for your own profit. But in some cases, considering, for example, the current situation of Iran, and being in a cyber war with other countries like US or whatever other countries, Israel or others as well, sometimes you have to be ready and to be able to fight back, and so you should somehow help your country. I'm not talking about politics or whatever, but consider that some researchers here in Europe or other countries, they have to help their agencies or such. I wanted to know your ideas about this.
We come from different places. I'm sort of immune to the you must help your country argument, because I've sort of lost my belief in countries somewhere along the way. I think countries and borders are mainly a fraud to keep people from seeing that their interests are much more aligned with each other than they are against each other. So I'm not so much a borders and countries person, but coming from where you are, there are problems with cyber warfare, and one of them is the lack of attribution. If nuclear weapons could be launched without attribution. I mean, the first thing the major superpowers did when the nuclear era came to be was to launch satellites so they could spot launches. They could see the infrared from the rocket launches. Why did they do this? Because the only thing worse than an adversary with nuclear weapons is if you don't know where it comes from. And with information warfare, as we now see it with Stuxnet, and the lack of attribution, you're going to see some terrible, terrible things. And the collateral damage from these attacks is basically unlimited when there is a lack of attribution. So must you help your country? I'm having trouble with that because I don't necessarily trust countries, and I think the world is better off if we, as a community, defend the population and defend the systems.
Yeah, but my question, so it might be better to ask it in this way. We already are in a cyber war, okay? So what can we do to prevent it or stop it from going further?
I think if we create or further systems that are maximally secure and help people understand the risks of computer technology and help them maybe not creating that one database that holds all the medical records or that one database that controls all the industrial gear or the one system that controls all the floodgates in Holland, or if we try to convince people that maybe computer security is not as wonderful as they want it to be. If we resist the vendors that say that they can make it all secure, if we can, I think those are valuable contributions. And helping surreptitious parties launch cyber weapons is in my mind maybe not a contribution to a safer world. Because the risk of look, they launched Stuxnet, somebody launched Stuxnet, realizing full well probably that it could get out, which, because it affects the major population, is in and by itself probably a war crime by current definitions. But they also realized that somebody could quickly turn around and turn Stuxnet into something that would make chemical facilities explode all over the world, or could turn it around to do terrible, terrible things. And they took the risk knowing that was in there. Do you want to be part of that? Do you want to be part, because then you are part of the military complex. Then you are building weapons, no different from building bombs or building, except that these weapons are poorly understood and used by people who themselves may not be convinced of all the risks, which scares the shit out of me. And I think it should scare the shit out of a hell of a lot more people. If that makes, I hope that's a good answer.
Thanks.
So maybe to add to what you just said, hacking for peace, hacking voting machines to get them cancelled, hacking the public transportation system so society realizes how badly it is. Is that a solution?
Well, I was hoping that the public transport system hacks would get more attention for the fact that these back-end databases still hold who is going where. Because whether or not the transaction with the payment transaction is secured does not change anything about these back-end databases holding everybody's transport movements. So I was hoping that the discussion would swing more in that direction of the huge privacy implications of the back-end. Because I don't think whether or not the transaction is secure is as interesting as the discussion, as the size of the discussion in Holland. But yeah, these things can be important. It can be important to show people that computer security is not a finished field. We're now handing the electronic patients record for the whole country to the insurers. Now that the population is by and large, through its representatives, has said, no, we don't want the electronic patients database to be developed as a national thing, as a thing by the government. So the government said, well, then we'll just have the insurers do it. These are the parties that you least want to have access to all this data, that you want to keep furthest from how everybody is, because the insurers see a profit. And the profit is knowing which people to not give cheap insurance, or even affordable insurance, because they represent a net loss.
I totally agree.
But these are important issues, and we need to, for them to be fully understood, people need to understand what a complete mess computer security is, and how in complete shambles. I mean, I'm not telling anything new to anybody here, but I'm telling something new to anybody not here. That computer security is a not properly understood field, populated by dickhead vendors that just want to sell anything to anybody at any price. And I see no progress in telling this to society, because society still wants to believe that this is not the case. Still wants to believe that we can build a totally safe electronic patient record, or a totally safe this, or a completely bulletproof that. And we're not making enough progress because we keep fighting. It's like whack-a-mole. You fight one thing, and then already 3 things are popping up. We're not making progress on the fundamental issue of telling people that look, this stuff is all going to be not secure, and it's going to be not secure probably for a couple more decades. Stop trusting it to the extent that you're trusting it.
Yeah, hi. How do you suggest we make it known to the general public? Because obviously,
I'm not
you're
sure.
standing here, but
I'm up for bright ideas. I've done what I can do, and I'm just noticing that it tends to be not enough.
Okay.
I don't think there's all that much more disaster that could happen. It's already happening at a pretty dense and increasing speed, and I think there's a general belief in the population in that progress is by definition a good thing, and that they're seeing all this cool stuff happening on their iPad, and that therefore the world must be going into a positive direction. I think that's hard to bust, and I'm sort of generally out of ideas. But if you have any bright ideas, please.
Well, I'm thinking about like a Bob Dylan 2.0, but I don't know how to picture this. But you know, it's something like that because you know.
Well, I already have a pretty bad voice, so.
Well, so did he.
Yeah. So.
Thanks.
Last question, or maybe. Okay.
Hi, I'm Volker Vigier, also from Society. My question, it connects to the other question a little bit. When speaking to people of influence, politicians, CEOs...
Politicians are no longer people with influence. They're just people that pretend to have influence.
All right, who are the ones with influence? The ones that are...
Politics is nothing more than telling us that they're not responsible. We don't do healthcare, corporations do healthcare. The market does everything. We don't determine our budget. The banks determine our budget by the rates that we can lend money at.
Let me leave politicians out of the word.
Okay,
my
yes,
question then.
people of influence.
How do you... what ways in trying to convince the people of influence of these necessary changes have you found are at least somewhat effective? So many things don't work. You mentioned many things that don't work, but you may have found every now and then that certain things do work.
The depressing thing is the only thing that's somewhat effective is chaos, mayhem, and disaster, which is really freaking depressive.
But doesn't that scare people?
No, but I mean,
and fear is always a bad...
We made a perfectly coherent argument about these voting systems in the summer of 2006. Look, this is wrong, and there's no transparency, and it's probably insecure, and nobody's ever tested whether it's secure, so by definition that means that the probability that it's insecure is really, really high. And we pointed out all these problems with these systems, and everybody just shrugged and said, well, the vendor says it's secure. How can it be insecure? How can you prove it's insecure? It's just you saying it. And then we got hold of one of these machines and proved that it was insecure. And then the whole discussion swayed the other way. So unless you can sort of hack it, it stands. Unless you can hack it, it's perfectly secure and wonderful. And a somewhat theoretical argument, or I would say fundamental argument, about why things are wrong a certain way and right another way, just simply doesn't seem to cut it. So I think the only way to make an impression is to just hack it, break it, show that it's broken. And I think increasingly we're seeing, at least in the Dutch press, we're seeing a coherent argument that the whole IT industry is corrupt, is just either malfeasant or incompetent or some combination of both, and it's just doesn't cut it. That these people in their expensive lease automobiles are driving around the ministries crazy with laughter, honking their horns, but are not actually delivering anything. That all these people are doing is brainstorming about who to blame for the next delay in some major project that they've just cashed in 30 million euros for. And we need to coherently keep making this argument that this industry is by and large corrupt, and that software and networking and services are by and large broken, probably by design and built by people and commissioned by people that had no idea of the priorities or of security or of anything. And if we keep making that argument long and hard and repeatedly enough, maybe it'll work.
Honestly think that's a bit
depressing.
Well, that too, but also, it doesn't really do a lot of people in the IT industry which do try their best justice. There's a lot of good people working out there, and
yeah, but they're surrounded by clowns, and they
yeah, but you make it sound like it's 80-20 or something.
Inevitably, they end up being sucked down in this swamp of pretending they can do more than they can because all the competition does and they can't compete if they don't, writing more hours than they have to, creating complexity. The incentives are just all wrong. This whole bureaucracy is built on billable hours. If you build systems based on how many hours people work on it, you're going to get very complex systems because anybody that can build something simple that just works is going to price themselves out of the market. So the incentives are just all wrong and all the good people drown in a sea of corruption and clowns. But you may feel differently, and I apologize to anybody that does wonderful things, but that's just all I see, is just the incentives are wrong, and so all the good people just drown by evolution.
Well, one final thing, I actually agree with the things you're warning about. But, well, you're being very, very cynical. That I do notice.
You just... Anyway, I think we're out of time, so thank you very much. And,
All right. Thank you very much.